This is the Sports Bash Warmup with Josh Hennig on 97.3 ESPN. Now, live inside the Matt Black Kia Studios, here's Josh Hennig.
I had a conversation with Brian Price this month, and, he framed it in a way that I hadn't even thought of. He said, they've gone from being concerned about innings, too many innings for some guys, to not enough innings for guys. So I think you're going to see shorter starts. I think you're going to see more bullpen use. You're going to see them try to maximize as many arms as they have, going forward. That's why I think depth is going to be very important, especially pitching depth.
That's right. We're actually talking about sports, logistics, rosters. How on earth is all this stuff going to work? Josh Hennig, the warm-up here on 97.3 ESPN. Text board is open for you as always at 609-403-0973. Coming up at 1:25 today, Jesse Dougherty covers baseball and the Washington Nationals for the Washington Post. He's been all on top of what is actually going on with the return to baseball. What on earth is this even going to look like? I mean, what? It's actually a little confusing. In fact, there's actually apparently 10 pages in this baseball manual that is just highlighting how to protect yourself from coronavirus. So we got a lot to get into today about baseball. Again, Jesse Dougherty is going to join us coming up at 1:25 today, talk more about exactly how all this is going down. Because here's the deal, folks. We have baseball around the corner. Baseball is coming. Sports are coming back. Now, what exactly it's going to look like, that's part of the conversation. That's why we open with the audio from Scott Lauber there. He was on the Sports Bash yesterday on 97.3 ESPN. And he talked about how this 60-game season is going to impact the Phillies. And one of the ways it's going to impact the Phillies is how they use their pitching rotation, the universal DH, who actually is going to play that DH, what it means to have all these different players basically being asked to play different roles. Remember, Gene Segura was supposed to play third base this year because they signed Didi Gregorius. Well, now, what is that going to look like? So there's a lot of stuff we still have to talk about baseball-wise, and we won't be able to talk all about it just today. Because just today, there's only so much time to discuss all this. And when you look at the Phillies going into this year, they signed Zach Wheeler to be one of their starters. And we know that guys like Wheeler and Velasquez, these are pitchers, along with Pivetta, who have had very, very interesting stretches of pitching well, and then other stretches where they absolutely exasperate you. And if one of the Phillies' priorities is to say, we want guys to go out there and get innings, but we also are going to use our relief pitchers a lot, it's going to be a delicate balance for the entire team. There's really no bona fide DH at this point on the team. There's no bona fide setup man on this team. I mean, I think people assume certain players may be in the conversation for the setup man. We're not even 100% sure who the starting five rotation is going to be. We assume it's Nola, Wheeler, Arrieta, but the two after that, I mean, is it really Eflin or Pivetta or Velasquez? Where does Spencer Howard factor into all this? And that's one of the things that Scott Lauber brought up was about Spencer Howard and the young pitchers who, let's be realistic, if this was a 162-game season, a lot of these guys would be in the minor leagues pitching. Well, there is no minor leagues this year. There is no single A, double A, triple A going on. And this is what Scott Lauber yesterday on the Sports Bash, Phillies beat reporter Scott Lauber, had to say about Spencer Howard and the other young pitchers.
Take a guy like Spencer Howard, like back in February and March, the Phillies were very concerned about his workload because he only threw 99 innings last year total between the Arizona Fall League and the minor league season. And how are they going to get through a season and have him available to throw meaningful innings late in the year? Well, now that's not going to be an issue. Now the challenge is, will he throw enough innings this year in order to set him up for 2021? And I think they're going to try to get guys like that on the mound as much as they can to make sure that not just for this year, but going forward, that those guys are taken care of.
The key phrase there, get them on the mound. You want to get these guys work. You want to get them out there. And for all these pitchers who have not been pitching for the last few months, I mean, yeah, some of them have been throwing off the mound and doing simulations of things, but they're not exactly pitching the live action right now. So when you look at a Phillies pitching staff with, again, we're assuming Hector Neris is the closer. I'm guessing. We're not 100% sure what is going on with half these guys who are coming off of injuries. Remember last year the Phillies went out and acquired a bunch of arms like Blake Parker and these other guys in the offseason like Drew Storen, saying, well, maybe they have a chance to make the roster. Maybe if, Francisco Liriano. You never finished spring training. You never solidified your actual roster and rotation. And now you're going into this year with these expanded rosters. You're going in there with, according to the rules, you're going to have a taxi squad, a bunch of guys who are basically just sitting around, waiting around in case they're working out, they're staying in shape, they're playing simulated action, but they're preparing for if someone does test positive for coronavirus, or someone does get injured, or someone has some other issue for why they can't go out there and play. We know guys like Mike Trout have wives and significant others who are pregnant right now who want to leave and spend time with their family for the birth of their child for however many days that could be. Mike Trout could miss an entire week of the season because of maternity leave. And then he has to come back and be retested. So what does that all mean? And that's one of the reasons why I love the conversation about the DH. Mike Gill and Hunter Birdie have been talking about this on the Sports Bash. And the DH thing fascinates me because, to me, if you were to ask me who should be the DH for the Phillies, my gut instinct is it should be some sort of combination of Jay Bruce and Rhys Hoskins. And the reason why I say those two guys is because when I think about the DH, usually the DH is a guy who is a better hitter than he is a fielder. And I think we all know that Rhys Hoskins is not exactly an elite first baseman. Jay Bruce has almost 1,500 games in the outfield, but he also has 52 games at first base. He hasn't actually had a lot of time in the DH side from a handful of games he had with the Mariners. So when you think about Jay Bruce and Rhys Hoskins, those are two guys who can play first base. If you go by the Phillies' depth chart on their website, they have Jay Bruce listed as a first baseman and not an outfielder. So take that for whatever that's worth. They have him as a backup left fielder and a backup first baseman. They have him listed on two different places on the depth chart. And again, this is all subjective because a lot of these rosters and a lot of stuff wasn't finalized before the coronavirus shutdown. But to me, if I'm looking at the Phillies, my gut instinct would be, well, take the two weakest fielders on the team, Hoskins and Bruce, and put them at the DH. But then the guys asked Lauber yesterday on the Sports Bash, Scott Lauber, Phillies beat writer, about Alec Baum, the young phenom that we've all heard about.
We'll see what their plans are for Alec Baum. You're going to have an active roster and a taxi squad. I guarantee you he's part of their pool of 60 players that they'll bring to spring training. Whether he's part of the active group or the taxi squad group, I think he should be part of the active group, which would involve adding him to the 40-man roster. I think that's a worthwhile move. I think he could get at bats as a DH and be productive as a right-handed hitting DH.
So there's another option. We talked about the potential of Baum getting playing time this year for the Phillies. Well, let's look at what he did in the minor leagues. In the minor leagues, he showed you that he has the ability to hit. The question for Baum has never been his bat. It's been his fielding. Last year, between all levels of the minor leagues, he hit 21 home runs and 80 RBIs. In 2018, at Wichita State, when he was playing college, he had 16 home runs and 55 RBIs. So we know he's got the bat. The question with him has always been about the fielding. You have a guy in Baum that has committed some errors. He has not been very consistent at times in the minor leagues as a fielder. So maybe a great way to get him major league experience is to make him one of the DHs. I think one of the things that's overlooked is that there's no traditional DH in baseball like it used to be back in the day with all the the big names in the 90s and the early 2000s. So as a result, the Phillies got to make a decision about when they do go out there and play DH, who's going to play first, who's going to DH, how are they going to organize the outfield. Andrew McCutchen is now a year removed from his injury. Adam Hazley showed you that he can play all three outfield positions. If Roman Quinn can be healthy, he could be a major asset out there for the Philadelphia Phillies. So a way to work around some of these questions about who's going to play the three outfield positions, because we know one of them is going to be Bryce Harper no matter what. And if McCutchen is healthy, you would assume he's in left field. And then center field would be probably either Hazley or Quinn. So what do the Phillies do after that? Is Jay Bruce your everyday DH? Or do you play Bruce at first base and put Hoskins at the DH? Or do you have Alec Baum on the roster as the alternative DH when you go against left-handed pitching and Bruce doesn't play? There's a lot of ways the Phillies can work around this. Let's remember that Jay Bruce is a guy who did play well for the Phillies when he was healthy last year. He had 12 home runs last year. With the Mariners, before they got to the Phillies, he had 14 home runs. He had a very good year last year for a guy in his early 30s that a lot of people had written off at this point in his life. Years ago, he was, one of the power hitters over in Cincinnati, and he's bounced around all over the place because ever since then, he's become a popular trade commodity. Now in his early 30s, people treat him like he's some really old guy, and he's really not. He's still got the power, he's still got the pop, but he's also left-handed. Go against left-handed pitcher, who you bring in? Bring in Alec Baum. The Phillies have a lot of options when it comes to the DH and the pitching staff, but these are questions that have to be answered. And we're not going to answer them all today because we're not fully sure who's exactly going to make the roster yet. When they report to spring training in a week and change, and when they go out there and they start resuming and getting back into quote-unquote baseball shape, guys got to overcome injuries. There's a lot of questions that have to be answered. And I'm curious to see what version of the Phillies lineup is going to go out there. Now, personally, like I said, I think that whoever doesn't play first base, it should be the DH between Hoskins and Bruce. And then filling in for Bruce against left-handed hitters should be Alec Baum. I really want to see Alec Baum on the team, not just because I think he's capable of getting the job done, because he does have a good bat, but I think because the experience is very useful for him. You have a player who doesn't have major league experience yet. And in this shortened 60-game sprint that's going to be the baseball season, you need to have all hands on deck. And at some point, Baum's got to get major league hitting time, and he hasn't gotten any minor league hitting time this year, so why not bring him up to the majors? By the way, I mentioned Jay Bruce. Like I said, Jay Bruce does have history, not a lot of history, but some history of playing first base. He has a .981 fielding percentage. in 52 games at first base. It's pretty solid. And the reason why I bring it up is because you compare him to Rhys Hoskins. While Hoskins has a better fielding percentage in 3 seasons of playing first base of .993, I think there's a lot of frustrations with Hoskins at first base in general because just last year he had 9 errors at first base. I think there should be a conversation to be had that you have a guy who is not the best athlete and may not be the best target of a first baseman. Now, we'll have to see if he's improved that or not. But I think the assumption was you have a 6'4" guy who's a power hitter, that he should be able to play first base. He might be better first baseman than an outfielder. But if you think about it, in 3 seasons, he's got 12 errors at first base. Jay Bruce, on the other hand, like I said, he's only played a full of 52 games. Well, it's not a huge sample size, but at least we know he can do it. I think that if you have a way to maybe alternate those guys at first base and the other guy plays DH, I think that's the way I would go. And like I said, you have Alec Baum mixed in there, like Lauber said. He's not getting time in the minor leagues because there is no minor leagues. And I think that's the way to go about it. Text board is open, 609-403-0973. This is what Lauber also had to say about Hoskins and Baum, because he thinks their long-term futures are at DH, because if we're going universal DH, maybe that's where Hoskins has to go.
Rhys Hoskins might be a future DH, if the DH comes to the National League full-time. Alec Baum might be a future DH if it comes to the National League full-time. So, Jay Bruce, when last we saw him, was just beginning to throw as an outfielder because, he had that issue with his forearm last year that turned him into pretty much a full-time pinch hitter. He's got the look, or at least had the look at the end of spring training part 1 of a full-time DH.
There you go. That could be your 3 DHs for this 60-game sprint. It might not be the original plan because obviously before the pandemic, we didn't expect there to be a universal DH. But hey, listen, maybe the Phillies are going to be okay with this DH situation. Maybe they have a way to work around it, because when you look at their roster right now, if you're going to go in there with 30 guys on an active roster and then 20 guys on a taxi squad, maybe you just go heavy on the flexibility of the lineups. One of the guys that is listed right now on the rosters are guys like Neil Walker and Logan Forsythe. If those guys make the official 30, those are 2 guys that can play multiple positions. Walker can play first base. He can play second base. Forsythe can play second base and the outfield. Maybe the long-term goal of the Phillies going into this season, this sprint, is have as much flexibility as possible. Have as many different guys who can play multiple positions as possible, because if someone does get injured, if someone does get coronavirus, if someone does have something happen to them, or like I said earlier, guys who are going to go on maternity leave, there are players who have expressed concern about being able to be there for the birth of their child. Whatever the scenario is, I think the more flexibility you have, the better. And if you could have a 3-man rotation, for lack of a better term, for the DH with Hoskins, Bruce, and Baum, I'm all for that. And like I said, you just load up the rest of the roster with versatile guys. Josh Harrison is a guy who's currently listed as a second baseman, but we know that he has a background of playing low outfield too. So maybe the Phillies' goal is to build an entire unit of guys who just can do multiple things. At least that's how I would do it. Because at this point, you just got to plan for any scenario. And if you're the Phillies, you just got to have as many bodies as possible ready to go. Text board is open, 609-403-0973. Tom from the Villas chimes in and says, I could see them using a DH as a rest spot with only 60 games. You have a guy like Harper who may want to rest, so they have him DH for a game and give him a break from playing in the field. That's Tom in the Villas. That's another option, Tom. Maybe you don't want to take a guy's bat out of the lineup, but you might want to give him a little bit of physical rest from running around in the outfield. And we don't know exactly the full breakdown of the games, but one of the things that's been talked about a lot is you could have 60 games in 66 days. Well, I think I'm pretty able to do basic maths. That's 6 off days. That's 6 off days over the course of a couple months. So that's another way, like Tom said, you can use a DH. The only reason why I'm not loving the idea of Harper is because I think Harper's worked very hard on his outfield fielding, and I think that he showed that he can be a good fielder. And I don't want to put some stiff out there in the outfield. No offense to Jay Bruce, but he's not exactly the most athletic guy in the world at this point in his career. Andrew McCutchen coming off an injury, who knows how ready he will actually be to resume the season. And I mentioned, there are guys like Logan Forsythe and Josh Harrison who do have a background in playing the outfield. Scott Kingery can play the outfield, but I think we prefer him stay at a primary position in the batting order at second base. But hey, you know what? Maybe you got to be open to that flexibility. Maybe you go into spring training and Girardi has to turn to the guys and be like, listen, if you've ever played another position for at least 40, 50 games in your career, you have an opportunity to possibly play that position in the 60-game stretch because we got to be as malleable and as flexible as humanly possible. Text board is open, 609-403-0973. Brendan from Margate chimes in and says, if Arrieta and Velasquez can pull their weight, this team has a chance. It's interesting because I get a feeling that Arrieta is actually going to benefit from this time off. He's had a lot of different health issues and a lot of different, wear and tear issues at this point in his career. Maybe all this extra time off is going to have him have a fresh arm. Maybe he's going to be able to go out there and just go, all in for a couple of months, and you don't have to worry about holding him back and making him stretch out for an entire 162. Velasquez is just an enigma. I mean, this guy is one of the most exasperating players on this team. We know he has arm talent, but how many times does he actually pitch more than 5 innings? It doesn't happen very often, and he has a handful of games where he looks great, and another handful of games where it feels like he can't do anything right. I mean, listen, Mike Gill brought this up for the last 2 years. I mean, I think this is a good point. Just make him the closer. Put him in the bullpen. I mean, if you're going to have a guy that's that erratic, just say, hey, listen, man, either you're going to be one of those, bridge starters where you only go a handful of innings to start a game, or you're the guy who comes in for the opener pitcher. Maybe you turn to Spencer Howard and you say, Spencer, we want to get you some throwing time, but you're only going to go 4 innings every game. Well, maybe you go to Howard and say, you go 4 innings, Velasquez, you go 4 innings, and maybe see what happens. We can get really creative with this stuff. It's going to be absolutely nuts. All right, text board is open, 609-403-0973. More of your texts coming up later this hour. But coming up next, Jesse Dougherty from the Washington Post. He's going to join us, talk about what is going on with this baseball regulations. How feasible is some of the things they're going to be asking the players and their families to do, too? Because remember, your family is not a baseball employee. How are you going to make sure that they do what they're told? We got a lot to get into with Jesse coming up next here on Warmup. Josh Hennig hanging out with you here on 97.3 ESPN. We remind you, 97.3 ESPN has teamed up with Seize the Deal for incredible weekly offers from some fantastic restaurants, just like this week's big deal. You get a $50 gift card to the High Point Pub, North Shore Road, Nabseeking for just $25. That's right, the High Point Pub always has great specials, and you can enjoy late-night outdoor dining till 2 a.m. That is Seize the Deal, starting tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. SeizeTheDeal.com for the High Point Pub. There's a chance it's going to sell out quickly, so you better be ready to jump right on that SeizeTheDeal.com and get this offer. For more information on this great Seize the Deal opportunity, go to the 97.3 ESPN mobile app. Welcome back into the warm-up. Josh Hennig here on 97.3 ESPN. We'll get back to your text in just a bit at 609-403-0973. But right now, joining us on the Boardwalk Honda hotline, Jesse Dougherty from the Washington Post wrote a very comprehensive article about what is really going on in these protocols and how feasible is it what baseball is going to be asking these players to do. We'll get into it all right now, coming up now with Jesse as he joins us right now on the Boardwalk on the Hotline. How you doing today?
Doing well. How are you guys?
Doing pretty good. So, listen, first of all, very good job with the article, because I think you really laid out all the questions that go with all of these protocols. And I think one of the things that stands out to me most is the fact that because this is not a bubble, there's so many variables for this to go sideways.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's, that's you're letting players and staff and coaches and stadium workers and delivery men for equipment are all going to be living at home, being out willing to leave the park every day, going to hotels. There's not that bubble model like we've seen with the NBA. There's not this hub city model like we've seen with the NHL. Even the NFL, which is obviously months out from having to start a season, has considered that sort of bubble model, so to speak. So I think there's a lot of aspects here that other leagues kind of tackle with the idea of just insulating everybody in the same sort of bubble environment. And when you open it up to, the whole world, honestly, and some of these markets that are persisting hotspots, you're asking for trouble. And the public health experts that I spoke with described that. I mean, describing this as a gamble, as a very difficult plan, as something that could really, cave in on itself very quickly. And I think there's certainly a lot of holes in the protocol from the mere fact that they're not going to use that bubble model.
One of the things you mentioned also here, you had two sources tell you that there was never a discussion about placing more formal restrictions on player movements away from the field. Now, do you think that's because of the fact that baseball realizes that they can't really follow these guys around and force them to follow certain procedures? So you're kind of, hoping that they're responsible adults, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a measure of that, and I think the expert I spoke with from Johns Hopkins, I think, described it well too. In that the idea of public health policy, I think you need to make sure that the public has some agency in it in order to make it work, rather than there being an antagonistic measure in terms of you cannot leave your house or you cannot leave the stadium or whatever it may be. I think there's a chance that people would want to rebel. They'd want to sort of push against that authority. And while it would maybe seem advantageous for the league to put in those sorts of measures, I think part of the discussion centered on, is it actually going to be counterproductive for us to try and police these guys in that kind of way? Could it have gotten in the way of a deal? Now, there's so many conversations here, whether you even think baseball should come back is another element of this, whether it's even safe. But I do think that restricting all movement and in this model was never on the table, just because it's unrealistic.
Now, one of the questions that was brought up, I heard somewhere else, was there was a player that, was off the record, but asked a baseball reporter, because apparently everybody's talking about this. One of the questions asked was, well, if I do test positive and I'm on the road, what happens? What happens if a guy does test positive, Jesse?
I mean, they're going to have so every team's going to have medical facilities designated close to each ballpark on the road. So there will be spaces, and teams will be aware on the forefront before traveling where those locations and facilities are, where they could go in the event of a positive test. I mean, that could lead to you being quarantined or receiving care or being sort of insulated while in a city that you don't live in. So let's say the Nationals were in New York, or the Nationals were in Miami or Atlanta. You may wind up in that facility for 2 weeks to, keep your symptoms from reaching anybody else, or for longer if it requires long-term care in order to beat the virus. So it's certainly a scary situation. I think the only way the league can address that with the model that they have right now is that they're going to have the necessary facilities ready to take players in potentially on the road. That's tough. There's obviously been overpopulating in a lot of hospitals in a lot of cities. A place like Houston right now is dealing with a huge crisis with the spiking cases, and that's obviously where the Astros play, and teams will be visiting there. So you wonder if the league is now unnecessarily taking resources away from hospitals, if if that's something that they should be doing during a global pandemic. But these are just the number of questions that are being asked.
Jesse Dougherty joining us here on the Boardwalk on the Hotline on 97.3 ESPN from the Washington Post. You mentioned resources. I think one of the things that, and maybe I don't fully understand all the details, but when baseball did shut down the minor league facilities for what they're calling a deep cleaning, My first reaction to that was, well, shouldn't you have been cleaning in the first place? I mean, is it just me, or does it feel like baseball is really pushed to the back burner, the real reason why we even had a shutdown 2 months ago in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's merit to that. I think we're learning that all sort of walks of society and businesses can probably operate in a more, responsible way. So whether that's more deep cleaning in facilities, or should we even be shaking hands all the time day to day? Should we be hugging each other if we don't know where each other's been? Not sanitizing or washing our hands maybe as often as we should be in normal times. So while I think there seems to be a sort of reckoning, so to speak, of how to deal with these facilities and cleaning procedures, I think that's more so in line with just how the whole world maybe is recognizing that there are better practices in order to stay safe as this thing sort of continues to roll on.
Now, among the things that's mentioned in this manual is the fact that is basically the suggestion that these guys, when they're not at the field, they should, as you put in here, quote, avoid situations in which high risk of contracting the virus is elevated.
Sure.
But part of that also, as you mentioned on your article and on Twitter, is this extends to people they're living with. So baseball is taking a serious risk by saying, oh, by the way, we're suggesting that the people that you live with also follow our guidelines, but they're not even our employees.
Right. I mean, it goes beyond families even. I mean, this goes to, hotel workers, it goes to friends, it goes to anyone you privately train with and then their families. I mean, when you start to think what it would take for an entire sports league to operate normally but insulate itself from the virus, you're talking about potentially dozens of thousands of people cooperating with safe practices. And it's just not realistic. So the immediate group is the players, coaches, staff, and their families. That then fans out to the next level of acquaintances and their families. That then fans out to their families, and on and on. So, I mean, when you think about trying to operate a sports league outside of a bubble right now, the challenge is insurmountable because you just are trusting that so many people are going to do the right thing. And I just don't find that to be realistic.
Now, one of the things we do know also is about these rosters. Explain to the audience a little bit about these expanded rosters and what they're calling taxi squads, and give us an idea of, how all of that is going to function, especially with a team when they travel on a road.
Yeah, so the roster makeup will be different. In a typical year, this year would have been a 26-man roster plus a 40-man roster in which to pull from in the event of injuries and whatnot, and moving players up and down. That's now expanded to 60 for the 60-game season. And on top of that, the active roster will start at 30, then go down to 28, and eventually settle at 26 for the last month of the season going into the playoffs. So instead of having a pool of 40 players to pull from, 14 extra from your usual active roster, you actually have double the number now, where it's 30 active players and 30 players on a taxi squad, which will train at a facility nearby the players' home park. For the Nationals, that will likely be in Frederick, Maryland. For other teams, I saw the Astros are thinking of using the University of Houston, but they will train and stay ready, and then players can be pulled from there sort of at will. And then on the road, the team is actually allowed to carry 3 extra players, one of which has to be a catcher if they're going to do so. So there are sort of a lot of wacky rules right now just to account for the fact that this season is going to be wacky. But it's certainly something that seems like the league put a lot of thought into with dates and the way the size is going to change as the season moves on.
Now, Jesse, for the Washington Post, you cover the Washington Nationals, and I got to ask you, for a team that's coming off of a World Series that I think a lot of people looked at and said, hey, they still have a chance to compete, do you feel like this is still a playoff team with this 60-game schedule? Because last year, if you would have taken the first 50, 60 games of the National season, I think most of us would have said, yeah, that's not a World Series team.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some merit to that. Now, obviously, the Nationals last year heated up after the 50-game stretch and became a much different team. I'm not sure how much, the 60-game season is going to change the calculus of who's competitive and who's not. I think it's still baseball. Good rosters will have a good chance. Middling rosters will have a smaller chance. Bad rosters will probably not have much of a chance. I mean, everyone jokes that the Mets get hot at the start of every year and then they fall off. So maybe this year they have a better chance at making the playoffs if they have a hot start. I think in some ways, competitively, it'll be fun to follow. It'll have kind of a college football feel of every game holding more weight and having an effect on your playoff chances more so than usual. But I think, like I said, good teams will be good, bad teams will be bad, and then maybe the middle teams have a bit higher of a chance to make a push just because of the truncated schedule. But I don't think it really shakes things up too much. Now,
to pull back the curtain for the listeners out there, someone like you who covers baseball on a daily basis. Have you been informed about how this is going to impact your ability to cover the team?
Yeah, I mean, it will be certainly different. I mean, we're going to mostly be on Zoom interviews. We're going to have to rely on our own personal connections to speak with players outside of what the group settings. We will be allowed in the ballpark as of now. I should add, and not to be a downer, but these things are not definite. I mean, this plan could tank quickly in spring training, so these are all tentative measures. But should there be a season, there will be a certain level of access for us to watch inside the park. Other than that, clubhouse access is negated, and speaking to players face-to-face will not be allowed either in the league's effort to keep their players away from the public as much as possible, especially when they're in their own facilities. So coverage changes for sure, but I think the best thing we can do now is cover this as a sports league operating in a pandemic, not a sports league operating as a sports league, just because there are a lot of things and storylines that are going to be important that revolve around the virus still.
Speaking of storylines, is there a storyline, whether it's with the Nationals or with the NL East, or you could pick and choose whatever. I'm kind of giving you an open floor here. Is there a storyline that deals with baseball specifically that stands out to you heading into this 60-game run?
That they're going to try and play this season during a pandemic. That's the biggest storyline. I mean, I think we can talk about these chances and whatnot, but until we actually know this can work, and until we see the early returns of this plan, I think the only storyline that matters, frankly, is that this is happening at a really unprecedented time in our country and the world, and that's what we'll have to follow the most closely.
He is Jesse Dougherty. Check out his great article on the Washington Post. Will MLB's health and safety plan hold up once baseball returns? As you say, Jesse, it will be a tough task. It's over at the Washington Post and over at the WashingtonPost.com. Jesse Dougherty, appreciate the time today, and I'm sure we'll be touching base in the future.
Great. Thanks so much.
Josh Hennig here on the Warmup on 97.3 ESPN. We'll get back to your text coming up next, 609-403-0973 here on the Warmup. Josh Hennig, 97.3 ESPN, and the 97.3 ESPN mobile app powered by First Bank of Sea Isle City. Welcome back into the warm-up. Josh Hennig here on 97.3 ESPN. Speaking of 97.3, 97.3 ESPN has teamed up with Seize the Deal for incredible weekly offers from some fantastic local restaurants. This week's big deal, you can get $50 gift card to the High Point Pub in Absecon for just $25. That's right, a $50 gift card for $25. High Point Pub always has great specials, and you can enjoy late-night outdoor dining until 2 a.m. on North Shore Road in Absecon. Get this great deal starting tomorrow at 9 a.m. at seizethedeal.com. Don't miss out on this great Seize the Deal, because there's a possibility this will sell out quickly. For more information on this Seize the Deal opportunity, check out the 97.3 ESPN app. Back to text board now, 609-403-0973. Dan from EHT chimes in and says, if this goes well, this might be the new blueprint for baseball. I mean, the 60 games and the regional stuff. Well, I would counter by saying this, Dan. First of all, I don't know if this is a blueprint because of the fact that baseball makes a lot of money off of the 162 games in terms of television money, in terms of ticket sales. You're talking about a sport that, according to Rob Manfred, is going to lose $4 billion this year without fan attendance and without a full schedule. So you could argue that a huge chunk of baseball's revenue is dependent on that schedule. Now, the point you make about the regional aspect, maybe that is something that gets implemented a little bit more. I would personally like to see more games for teams who are in their region. One of the things I know is exasperating for a lot of us sports fans is when the Phillies go to the West, those West Coast trips, and you have, the Colorado Rockies at 9:30 one night for a series, and then the next series you go to San Diego and it's 10:05 first pitch on the East Coast. Maybe there is something baseball can do to have less games in different time zones for teams. Maybe instead of having the Phillies or another team on the East Coast travel for so many West Coast trips, maybe you eliminate the West Coast trip from the schedule. Or maybe you only have it maybe one West Coast trip and you have try to have as many games as possible in only Eastern and Central time zones if you're an Eastern time zone team. Maybe that is something that could be a blueprint to say, we're trying to appeal more to the people in this region, in this part of the country, the fan base specifically here. Maybe that is an opportunity for baseball to kind of change things up with the schedule, Dan, from EHT. I do like that idea. I think that there is something to be said for the fact that I think that one of the problems baseball has is that they've, aside from the fact they've done a poor job at marketing their game to younger people, is the fact that I know for a lot of people, how many people really want to stay up till 1 o'clock in the morning to watch a Phillies game? It's okay, aside from Hunter Brody, who just walked back in the studio here, aside from Hunter Brody, I think the majority of people would like to go to bed at some point at night. And I think that staying up for a late night game is sometimes exasperating, especially when it might be the 8th inning and you're losing 8-1 and you have, I don't know, Blake, what's his name? Blake Parker come into the game and he's trying to get outs and he's giving up home runs left and right. You know, I mean, that's a little exasperating. I think that is an idea there for BHT. Maybe part of the blueprint for moving forward is baseball has fewer teams have games outside of their specific time zone. They get more games in that market time zone frame. Maybe that is an idea. I'm not saying they're going to take the idea of Dan for BHD, but I do think it's an interesting idea. Text Sports open 609-403-0973. Dan from Tuckerton chimed in a little bit earlier and said, I have a $50 bet that the Major League Baseball season will be shut down before it gets to the 60 games. What do you think? Well, what I think is this. I think that, first of all, you got to make sure that whatever bet you're making with that shutdown, you make sure that the person that you made that bet with, you are both in agreement of exactly what a shutdown means. Because I'll give you an example. What if a specific team has a COVID-19 outbreak on the one team, and that team is maybe already out of the running for the playoffs? What if, let's say it's the Marlins, okay? And after the first 40 games, they're 10-30. And then they have 20 guys who test positive for COVID-19. Well, if one team shuts down for the rest of the year, but the rest of the league keeps playing, does that mean you win or lose your $50? You got to make sure that you set the prerequisites for your bet with whoever you're betting with. Because a shutdown of one team is not the shutdown of the whole league. Now, if you're talking about the shutdown of the whole league, the only reason why I will personally think that that won't happen is because, as Scott Lauber mentioned in the Sports Bash yesterday, as Jesse Dougherty just mentioned from the Washington Post, the idea is that you're going to have these super expanded rosters. So if a guy does get injured or a guy does test positive, or you have multiple people get sick or multiple people get injured, you can cycle other people into play. Baseball seems to have this theory, whether it's a valid theory or not, I think is up for debate for sure, but they have a theory that they can control the situation enough that if someone does test positive, they don't have to shut down the league. Now, considering the fact that some states have major escalations of positive tests versus other states, and some states have a lot of asymptomatic people testing positive, much more than symptomatic people, there's something to be said for the fact that if baseball says we're going to test people every other day, and our system is set in place to make sure that we don't have a season shut down, maybe they have a theory. Whether that theory works or not, I think is an interesting conversation. But I think you got to make sure that your bet is a little concrete, because there is, I think, a higher possibility a team shuts down before it reaches 60 games than the full league. Because I wouldn't be surprised if there's a team that is playing poorly and, maybe around the 40 or 50 game mark, the guys just say, you know what? This stinks. we're having a horrible year. We don't care about the rest of the year. Let's go out and have a party. And then you have 20 guys go out there and get COVID-19 and the team gets crippled from playing the rest of their schedule. I can totally see that happening. Text board open, 609-403-0973. By the way, I love this text earlier. It says, the first thing I would have done last offseason was cut Vince Velasquez. Listen, I'm all for the Vince Velasquez hate. I think Vince Velasquez is arguably the most exasperating player on the Phillies of the last few years, hands down. There is no reason why a guy who is that talented would be that inconsistent, except for the fact that he really shouldn't be a starting pitcher. Like I said, Mike Gill brought this up 2 years ago that he should be a closer. I'm all for that. Just get him out of the starting rotation. It's obvious the guy consistently can't pitch a full 5 to 7 innings without basically imploding. Just because he has a handful of games where he looks incredible, it's just a sign that he has great talent. Not that he's a great starting pitcher. I mean, for goodness sake, in 2018, he went 9-12 with a 4.85 ERA. This guy has never had an ERA under 4 in his major league career. And I'm supposed to sit here and be all excited about Vince Velasquez starting for the Philadelphia Phillies? Oh, come on, get out of here. I'm telling you, if you ask me who my starting rotation is right now, without any further information, I go Nola, Wheeler, Arrieta, Eflin, and Spencer Howard. Because you know what? You're not going to have any minor leagues for Spencer Howard to pitch in. You might as well see what he's got in the major league level. Get him some experience. And then Vince Velasquez could be either the long reliever or the bridge to the closer guy. Because I think for an inning or two, Velasquez can just go out there, throw his smoke, light up the strikeouts, and then get him out of there before things get carried away. Because it seems like whenever a team sees him for the second or third time through the batting order, it's, oh, here we go. It's going to implode now. Here he goes. Vince Velasquez, we know it's coming. Either a home run, a guy gets hit by a pitch, or he gets so erratic he walks a guy, then gives up a home run. It's always something like that. It's just who Vince Velasquez is.